The story began at Valjeer Academy, during the graduation ceremony held in the Academy's grand marble hall under a pristine sky. Among the names called that day was Michael Foxon, a standout graduate. As he stepped onto the podium, he greeted the audience with calm confidence, introducing himself as a proud second-year graduate of Valjeer Academy. In the distance, reclined on a thick branch, a young man watched him with a mocking smile. He remembered a time when Michael could barely string together a greeting without stuttering. His gaze lingered on Michael's white hair, which he mentally compared to a drifting puff of cotton. From his perch, he listened as Michael continued, voicing heartfelt gratitude for the 3 transformative years he had spent at the Academy. Michael stated that those years had been the most important of his life. The observer, Chris, smiled faintly, lost in his own memories. He reflected on how taxing it had been to stay in the shadows, playing the part of a background character. But with his main mission now behind him, he believed he could finally settle into a quiet, ordinary life. That belief shattered the moment Michael mentioned his name. He proclaimed that he owed everything to his mentor and guide, Chris. The words stunned Chris. Michael turned his gaze skyward, offering thanks and saying he wouldn't be who he was without Chris's unwavering support. Chris remained frozen, confusion growing. Michael didn't stop. He thanked Chris for never giving up on him, even during his weakest moments, and for always standing by him. Then, with resolute sincerity, Michael asked for a chance to return the favor. He declared that he would stay by Chris's side for the rest of his life, a pledge that left Chris speechless. The crowd reacted with loud protest. Chris suddenly realized that many explorers had been eyeing Michael for recruitment, drawn by his remarkable abilities. As the commotion grew, several other graduates, former students of Chris, rose from their seats. They announced their intentions to follow Michael's lead. They shared their desire to accompany their former teacher, Chris Dutton. One by one, 5 students pledged themselves to him, leaving Chris overwhelmed, unable to grasp what was unfolding. He began to question the situation, wondering how he had landed in such a bizarre role. Panic gripped him, and internally he screamed that he was nothing more than a forgotten side character. He feared he had derailed the story entirely. Memories from before his teaching days at Valjeer Academy flooded back, specifically, a brutal car crash from his past life. Lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him, he had seen a strange message appear before his fading eyes. It had labeled itself a main mission. A new life for something. It had asked if he wished to accept. Chris had felt a surge of fear, wondering if death had finally come for him. But then the word live appeared, urging him to choose. With desperation and resolve, Chris decided he didn't want to die, not there, not then. Clinging to the urge to live, he reached out and accepted the mission. The instant he made that choice, he awoke in a strange new place. A woman in formal attire welcomed him, remarking that he had finally regained consciousness. Chris noticed that she couldn't see the same floating message he did and was shocked when she addressed him by a new name. She handed him an identification card labeled Chris Dutton, informing him that he was the newest faculty member at Valjeer Academy. Despite the foreign symbols, he found himself able to read it clearly. She explained that his first day had technically already passed. The welcoming ceremony was over, delayed due to a train accident he had been involved in. She reassured him that the Academy would understand his absence. Panic seized him. He demanded a mirror, needing to see his new face. As he looked into it, another message appeared, stating that he had been reincarnated as a teacher at Valjeer Academy, and his main mission would span 3 years. Chris suddenly remembered Valjeer Academy was the setting of a fantasy novel he used to read casually. The plot had centered on a weak protagonist who gained godlike power and changed the world. Chris scoffed, thinking about the absurdity of his new reality, but details of the story eluded him, and he couldn't recall who exactly Chris Dutton had been. Another message appeared, warning that a teacher must have students, and that he had just 24 hours to report to the Academy's main gate. The penalty for failure: death. Terror struck him. He began to scream, paralyzed by the threat of dying once more. The nearby staff member looked at him with deep concern, believing he'd gone mad. Discharged early from the clinic, Chris winced from the lingering pain. As he wandered the city, he grumbled about being nearly broke. The clinic had drained half his funds. He recalled the nurse coldly demanding an outrageous sum for treatment. Now, he realized the local currency was gold, and the Academy was a half-day's walk away. Still disoriented, he wondered who exactly Chris Dutton was supposed to be. On instinct, He attempted to open a personal status window. It materialized, revealing stats that were both ridiculous and depressing. He was marked as a reclusive mage with passable magical power, the agility of a snail, and defense weaker than paper. Then came the real blow. A red warning. Illegal player. No magical skills permitted. Chris stared in disbelief. All those stats were worthless if he couldn't cast a single spell. He shouted at himself in bitter humor, asking if he'd been reborn into a pirated version of the world. Passers-by gave him odd looks. His anxiety only worsened. He remembered that in this world, only monsters lacked the ability to use magic. Fear crawled through him. If anyone discovered his condition, he could be branded a monster and executed. He imagined pleading for his life before a furious crowd. Then he noticed the countdown still ticking away. It pushed him into motion. He told himself there was no time for panic. He reminded himself he'd been given another chance. There was some luck in this. He had the cover story of a reclusive mage and experience from playing similar roles in online games. Recalling his gaming days, he clung to the praise he'd once earned for his role-playing skills. He resolved to fake it, to act like a mysterious powerhouse, hiding his flaws behind a mask of strength. At last, he reached the academy. A stone statue near the gate spoke, annoyed that the ceremony had ended a week prior and no one remained. But then it sensed a powerful presence approaching. The statue's awareness sharpened. It felt something beyond normal. The source was Chris Dutton. The statue registered the man's stark black hair, wild like a beast's mane, and his pale skin, almost glowing under the moonlight. His eyes were dark as night, and they burned with unspeakable emptiness. The aura he carried made the statue think of death in human form. Chris walked up, glared at the statue, and remarked coldly that a rock like it had no business guarding such a place. The statue snapped that he should identify himself and explain his purpose. Chris responded with authority, announcing that he was Chris Dutton, the new teacher, and ordered the gate to open. As he passed through, the pain and exhaustion overtook him. Out of sight, he collapsed, admitting how dire things truly were. Still, a flicker of relief came. He'd made it in time. He was alive. He began to think that this character he was pretending to be wasn't half bad. He decided to give this persona a name. The overpowered teacher with zero motivation. A man who looked lazy but wielded the strength of a battle-hardened warrior. The kind of character who could offer life-changing advice to the story's real hero. He recalled the backstory. This man had lost someone dear because of a mistake. It had broken him until the headmaster of Vol'jir Academy offered him salvation. Chris realized that the most vital element of this persona was the trauma, and the refusal to accept students. He mused about how the character would treat new recruits, dismissing them arrogantly, claiming they were unworthy of his teachings. Chris thought the plan fit perfectly. He'd make his students believe they had to become stronger if they ever wanted to witness his magic. That illusion of distance and superiority would give him the cover he needed. But before he could savor the brilliance of the idea, he noticed blood smeared across his hand. Alarm flooded his mind as dizziness and intense pain followed. The wound from the train accident had reopened. As if mocking him, a message window popped up, notifying him that he'd received the academy map as a reward. Rage surged within him. He didn't need a map, he needed healing. In his current state, even reaching the infirmary felt impossible. Helpless and trembling, Chris stood frozen when a student approached, concern etched across his face. The student asked if he was all right, pointing out the blood dripping from Chris's forehead. Chris's gaze locked on the strange symbol etched faintly across the student's cheek, and realization struck him. This wasn't just anyone. This was Michael Foxon, the original protagonist of the novel. Michael hadn't awakened his cursed power yet. His hair was still brown, and his presence was anything but commanding. He just looked like a scared, awkward student. Chris decided this was the moment to solidify his role. He'd play the cold, detached teacher who didn't concern himself with the weak. He questioned Michael harshly, demanding to know why he was loitering outside during lesson time. Michael responded nervously, explaining that he'd fallen behind in class and had been banned from the training grounds by his former teacher. Chris studied him, now understanding Michael's low status among the other students. He could barely manage a basic fireball. Still, Chris felt a twinge of irritation at how the boy had been treated. It wasn't right, but he couldn't show sympathy now. Michael unexpectedly apologized, his voice trembling and his eyes moistening. Chris hadn't even aimed his coldness at him directly, yet the boy looked ready to cry. Feeling awkward, Chris impatiently asked what class Michael belonged to. He needed to return him quickly. Things were starting to spiral. Then came another twist. A mission window materialized in front of Chris, blunt and merciless. He had less than 10 minutes to reach his classroom and begin his first lesson as the homeroom teacher of Class 10. Failure meant death. Despite the map now in his possession, Chris couldn't make heads or tails of the layout. Based on the context, he assumed Michael had to be from Class 10. Michael confirmed it nervously, saying he was a member of that very class. Chris ordered him sharply to lead the way. Michael hesitated but complied, his fear evident in every step. Chris eventually had to carry Michael most of the way. By the time they reached the classroom, Chris was barely holding himself together. Exhaustion screamed through every fiber of his body, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Michael, on the other hand, collapsed immediately upon arrival, groaning in fatigue. His classmates jeered, mocking his dramatic entrance and telling him to sit down and stop causing a scene. Then Chris entered. The students stared, stunned by his appearance. Blood still streaked his face, and his dark aura filled the room like a thundercloud. Chris scanned the classroom with an expression of disdain. He declared that all of them were trash and openly criticized the headmaster, Valjeer, for the subpar quality of students he had been given. Whispers filled the room. Confusion and discomfort spread. One student, Nika Toot, raised his hand with smug confidence. As the top student in the class, he demanded to know who Chris was and questioned if he even had permission to be there. Chris responded smoothly, stating that his name was Chris Dutton. Recognition dawned on Nika's face. He remembered the rumors about the new teacher who'd been injured in a train accident. Before Nika could say more, Chris cut him off with a cold command to be silent. Internally, Chris cringed. His entrance had been an utter disaster. He just hoped it wouldn't be held against him. Realizing he had no choice, Chris knew the lesson had to start. He didn't have the luxury of pre-written scripts or insider knowledge like most reincarnated protagonists. Still, he moved forward. With no better option, he grabbed a piece of chalk and made a bold decision. He wrote one word on the board: self-study. The students were stunned. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to bewilderment. Chris had just started their first class with a self-study session. He could feel his face burning in embarrassment, but he kept his posture straight, leaning into the absurdity of the role he was playing. Then he pushed it further. He pretended to fall asleep right there, as if teaching them wasn't even worth the effort. The class sat in shocked silence. Chris, meanwhile, felt an odd satisfaction at his performance. He wondered, half-jokingly, if this even counted as a lesson. But his moment of triumph was shattered. A sharp voice rang through the room, scolding him for his ridiculous behavior. Panic surged in Chris's chest. The voice belonged to a girl, one he instantly recognized. Angelina Sharif stood tall, furious. She berated Chris for missing the opening ceremony and tarnishing the Academy's reputation. Chris knew who she was. The Ice Princess. A duke's daughter. A potential heroine candidate. She was elegant, powerful, and proud, and she declared her complete rejection of everything Chris represented. The other students, most of them nobles, began murmuring in agreement. Chris knew this could cause long-term problems. But he had already chosen his mask, and he wouldn't drop it now. He told Angelina coldly that if she didn't like being in his class, she could leave. She froze, stunned by his bluntness. Chris repeated himself, this time with even more anger. He warned her not to make him say it a third time. The room fell into a tense silence. Angelina's face flushed with fury. She responded bitterly that she had no intention of learning from someone like him. She said he wasn't even capable of keeping up with proper lessons and declared that she wouldn't waste her time on a worthless teacher. With that, Angelina stormed out. The classroom filled with whispers, surprised, nervous, and uncertain. Chris remained still, maintaining the cold expression on his face, even as uncertainty stirred beneath the surface. At that moment, Chris admitted to himself that this reaction was entirely expected. Most of the students were high-born nobles, raised on pride and entitlement, and he wondered how many would remain loyal to a teacher like him. Anxiety crept in as he considered the consequences of his harsh performance. He feared losing his job before it had even properly begun and silently placed his hopes on the academy headmaster to back him up when the backlash inevitably arrived. Just then, a new message window flashed before his eyes, informing him that he had successfully completed the mission. The rewards included an academy map and something called a monkey medal. The unexpected success brought a wave of relief. He scanned the classroom and noticed that nearly half the students had already walked out. The ones still seated were key characters: Michael, the protagonist, along with the top-ranking students and potential heroines. Chris quickly identified them: Dulcie, the sharp-eyed redhead with a fiery presence; Belle, the quiet girl known for her healing abilities. He made a mental note to delay introducing the last key member of the cast, who hadn't appeared yet. Now was the time to play the role of the wise mentor. Standing straight, he addressed the remaining students with a voice filled with confidence and grit. He warned them that learning magic with anything less than complete dedication was a direct path to death. He declared that Valgir Academy was not a school. It was a killer's forge. His words hit like a whip. Shock spread across the room. The students were left stunned, their wide eyes betraying both fear and confusion. Chris pressed forward, explaining that the so-called accidents involving students were no accidents at all. They were cover stories for those who had mishandled the power they wielded. He asked them plainly if they were truly ready to bear the consequences of failure, of magic unchecked. Silence fell over the class, deep and complete. No one dared to speak. Satisfied, Chris turned on his heel and exited the room. Outside the building, laughter burst out of him. Loud, uninhibited relief. It felt like a decade of his life had just been carved out from the sheer pressure of staying in character. He knew he had to adapt, and quickly. This world was no dream. His thoughts turned to the monkey medal, the quirky little item he'd earned. He pulled out the keychain and examined it. It was monkey-shaped, absurdly cute, and oddly impressive. He couldn't deny liking it, but he hesitated to put it on, afraid it might ruin the intimidating persona he was crafting. A message popped up asking for confirmation. Equipping the keychain would lock it in place for 5 minutes. Chris hesitated, then decided to see what it could do. As soon as he confirmed, another window appeared, informing him that his agility stat had increased from F to E. He exclaimed to himself that it was practically a cheat item. Chris quickly tucked the keychain under his shirt, relieved it wouldn't mess with his image. He was happy to gain a boost, especially one that might help him avoid a sword to the face. But before he could celebrate too long, a new notification arrived, with a strange caveat. It stated that every sentence he spoke would now automatically end with the word, Kai. Chris froze. Confused, he began muttering to himself and, to his horror, the bizarre suffix tagged itself to everything he said. Panic hit like a brick. He shouted in disbelief, asking if the game was implying he was a monkey, and raged that someone like him should never be cursed with this kind of speech. In the middle of his rant, a voice called to him. It was Angelina. She appeared behind him, surprised by the scene, and asked hesitantly if he was Professor Chris. He turned slowly, his expression composed, and asked why she was there. Angelina inwardly cursed herself for not casting a concealment spell. She had been caught while sneaking off to smoke a cigarette. Chris's piercing gaze froze her in place. She knew instantly that this was someone who didn't make exceptions, not even for nobles. Not even for the Sharif name. Chris instantly recalled what kind of character Angelina was. A cold, genius noble who placed all trust in her own strength and refused to rely on anyone. Angelina, in turn, found that his gaze struck deeper than she expected. It reminded her of painful memories, and it weakened her resolve. Chris approached her in silence, and his quiet advance made her nervous. She wondered if he was about to search her or prevent her escape. Unable to bear the pressure, Angelina confessed on the spot that she had been smoking and said she would accept whatever punishment he deemed appropriate. Inwardly, she hoped that Chris would declare her unfit to carry responsibility, that he would be the one to finally reject her, freeing her from the impossible burdens she carried as a noble heir. But instead, Chris did something entirely unexpected. He gently touched her forehead and, thanks to the keychain, called her a pitiful little girl, ending his sentence with, Kai. Angelina was confused and asked what he meant by that. In that moment, Chris felt a wave of empathy for her. He recognized the familiar mask she wore, rebellious actions to hide deeper pain. He remembered someone he had once failed, someone he had held in grief and guilt, and reminded himself that no power could erase the past. Angelina, stunned by the tenderness of his words, felt something shift. It wasn't pity that touched her, but understanding. Then she noticed the monkey keychain peeking from under Chris's shirt. She concluded that he must have received it from someone important. She apologized to him silently for stirring painful memories, for behaving like a foolish child. Chris, meanwhile, wondered nervously if she had noticed the "Kai" tick in his speech. Angelina returned to the classroom, leaving Chris to his thoughts. Inside, Belle asked her where she'd gone, but Angelina simply replied that she had been thinking about Professor Chris. Back in the classroom, Nika Toot was visibly excited. He declared that with only 5 students left, himself, Michael, Dulcie, Belle, and Angelina, Class 10 was now an elite unit. Dulcie, with her usual sass, remarked that the others had run off like cowards and said she wanted to show them what real strength looked like. Her teasing clearly targeted Michael, whose red cheeks betrayed his embarrassment. Chris noted this dynamic with dry amusement, mentally dubbing Dulcie the mischievous type of heroine. Belle intervened, lightly scolding Dulcie and reminding Michael to focus. She turned to Chris and politely asked what the lesson plan was for the day. Chris paused, then realized he couldn't stall anymore. He told them, with a serious tone, that today's class would be a field training session. A message suddenly popped up, outlining a new mission. Class 10 had to travel to Vanet's Plains and defeat 50 monsters within 24 hours. The classroom faded from view as a massive magic circle ignited beneath their feet. The light engulfed them all. In a flash, the scenery shifted. They stood in the vast beauty of Vanet's Plains. The students stared in awe at the sudden teleportation, marveling at the magic. Nika burst into praise, saying Chris had mastered spatial magic even before they had received their official weapons. But Chris stood stiff, confused. The teleportation hadn't been his doing, and he had no idea who had activated it. Just moments earlier, they had been inside the classroom. Now they stood under the open sky of the Vanet's Plains, the sudden shift in scenery leaving the students disoriented. Dulcie, ever observant, pointed out a strange shadow flickering above Professor Chris's head. She asked how such an advanced magical transport could have happened, especially since no one among them had the ability to cast it. Chris immediately sensed something was wrong. This hadn't been part of the mission briefing. The teleportation hadn't come from him. It had been triggered by someone or something else. As the realization struck, a cold shiver crawled down his spine. That's when it appeared. A horned rabbit, towering, monstrous, and completely unnatural, emerged with a terrifying roar. A system notification confirmed Chris's fear. They had been summoned here by an unidentified third party. Dulcie and Angelina cried out, warning Chris of the monster looming right behind him. Terror clenched Chris's chest. For a split second, he wondered if this was the end, if he was truly going to die here, overwhelmed before even starting. There were still 50 monsters to defeat, and now this monstrous creature was practically breathing down his neck. But Chris steadied himself. He reminded himself that he wasn't just Chris, panicked newcomer to a fantasy world. He was playing the role of Chris Dutton, powerful, composed, and dangerous. He asked himself what that version of him would do, and the answer came instantly. Chris Dutton would treat this as a training opportunity, nothing more. A test. A sharpening stone for his students' resolve. With that, he barked a commanding question to the students, asking if they had forgotten why they came here. His voice snapped them into motion. Angelina responded with disbelief, saying it was reckless to treat this scenario like a drill. But Nika, always the eager achiever, stepped in and interpreted Chris's behavior as brilliance. He confidently declared that, naturally, Professor Chris would handle the giant monster on his own, and the students only needed to take care of the smaller enemies. Chris felt an enormous weight lift off his shoulders. Nika had unknowingly covered for him. Angelina, still skeptical but unwilling to show hesitation, put her trust in Chris's supposed plan. She began casting a high-tier spell, channeling her ice spear with sharp precision before charging at the encroaching monsters. Belle quickly claimed the role of support, assuring everyone she'd heal the wounded. Michael, despite his trembling hands, focused on building up his magical energy. He whispered to himself that he had to succeed, just once. Together, the group pushed back. Blow by blow, spell after spell, they managed to defeat all 50 of the smaller monsters. Chris watched them with genuine admiration. He quietly acknowledged that this was exactly what he expected from story protagonists and their destined companions. Then he turned back, and there it was. The horned rabbit still stood, its massive frame casting a shadow across the battlefield, eyes gleaming with primal hunger. Chris's blood went cold. He stood face to face with it, smiling nervously even as panic roared inside his chest. He thought, almost comically, that passing out before the pain hit might have been the better route. But he shook that thought off. There was no giving up. If he failed here, death would come for real. And if he had to die, then it would be after putting up a damn good fight. Meanwhile, Michael was still locked in battle with the smaller creatures. Then he turned, and saw Chris alone, facing the giant beast. His heart dropped. A scream tore from his throat as he realized that Chris was in real danger. He ran toward him, shouting that the situation was impossible. His mind spiraled into memories, loss, failure, guilt. Michael believed that once again, someone was dying because of him. Tears streamed down his face as he blamed himself for being too weak to save anyone. He reached out, asking aloud if this was truly his fault. Belle tried to stop him, warning that getting closer was suicide, but Michael shouted that the teacher was still alive. Belle's voice softened with sorrow as she said it was already too late. She added that Chris had likely sacrificed himself to save them, that the monster was full now and slowing down. Michael refused to accept it. He clutched Belle's arms desperately, insisting she could heal Chris. But Belle could only apologize. Her magic couldn't undo death. The world blurred as Michael broke down, memories consuming him. He remembered a moment with Chris, not long ago, when he had asked the teacher to help him grow stronger. He had admitted he had no right to ask, but begged anyway, saying he wanted the strength to take responsibility and stop running away. Chris had looked at him with calm conviction and told him that he would become strong. In that moment, Michael had felt hope. Chris was the only one who had ever truly believed in him. Now, Dulcie's voice rang across the battlefield, fierce and determined. She shouted for the others not to give up and to keep fighting. Nika responded immediately, unleashing a powerful offensive spell to rally the group. But Michael remained frozen. He still believed he was the weak link, the one who should have been eaten instead. Belle pleaded with him to flee, but he stayed put, sobbing, wishing death upon himself if it meant saving the others. And then it came. A voice. Cold, eerie, and strangely gentle. It whispered to Michael that if he truly desired strength, he had to take its hand and surrender to it completely. The voice promised power, but at a price. Michael faltered. His grief began to give way, but then, something shifted. A sudden change. A flash of light. A voice cut through the chaos, ordering everyone to stop immediately. Chris stood tall, alive and unbroken. The monster was dead. Chris's clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he radiated authority as he sarcastically asked why his students were trying to flee when there were still monsters left to kill. Shock swept across the field. The impossible had happened. Chris had survived. At that moment, a new message window appeared in front of him. It confirmed that 27 out of 50 monsters had been defeated. The mission was far from over, but their greatest obstacle had already been crushed. The path forward was beginning to clear. One student shouted in disbelief, asking if Professor Chris had allowed himself to be eaten on purpose just to strike the monster from the inside. Chris didn't clarify, but he silently thanked the student for giving the perfect excuse and ran with it. He scolded the class for making noise and losing focus, reminding them sharply that today was their field training. He chastised them for forgetting their mission and attempting to flee at the first sign of chaos. Another student, Nira, called out, warning that it was too dangerous to return to the battlefield now. The red-headed Dulcie, brimming with confidence, announced that her eyes wouldn't miss a single detail. She added playfully that even if the others had been fooled, she would figure out whatever Chris was hiding. Her tone was light, but the threat behind her words sent an involuntary shiver down Chris's spine. She frightened him more than most monsters did. Looking around, Chris noticed that several students were in tears, because of him. Guilt tried to claw its way to the surface, especially when his gaze landed on Michael, the protagonist. He questioned what kind of main character Michael was supposed to be, considering his powers were still dormant. Chris felt a pang of responsibility but quickly buried it under his usual cold facade. Angelina stepped forward, demanding answers. She asked if it had really been necessary to go that far. She explained that after seeing him get eaten, the students kept fighting, thinking it was a test. She accused him of recklessly risking everything for what she called a dangerous performance, criticizing him for not ending the battle instantly. Chris considered whether to explain the truth, that the monster had exploded from within because his overwhelming magical energy had been too much to digest. Monsters were drawn to magic, and Chris's presence was like gourmet bait. But instead of sharing that detail, He responded icily that anyone unhappy with his methods was free to leave. Michael stepped in, voice shaking with remorse. He apologized repeatedly, vowing never to repeat the same mistake. He begged Chris not to abandon him. Chris felt that same guilt rise again, but he kept his expression stern. Chris then explained to the class that in this world, magic power determined survival. He told them that monsters were born with minimal magic and needed to absorb it from others to grow stronger. He revealed that his own magical output was so high that to monsters, he was like premium foie gras topped with caviar. Irresistible. He likened it to trying to stuff a watermelon into a tiny sack. The monster simply couldn't take it. As he surveyed the battlefield, Chris realized that with the boss monster down, the smaller enemies would now rush them. But he was impressed to see his students already fighting in flawless coordination. He admitted inwardly that they seemed in perfect sync, even without his instruction. At the very least, he thought, he should be able to protect himself. He equipped the monkey keychain again, knowing it would boost his agility. The upgrade raised his rank from F, what he called snail, to E, or big bro snail. It wasn't spectacular, but it might help him dodge something lethal. Just as he adjusted the keychain, a monster lunged at him. He ducked back just in time, barely dodging the deadly strike. Michael cried out, asking if the professor was all right, then fired off a blast to take down the attacker. Chris exhaled sharply, thinking that if he were still F rank in agility, he'd be missing half his cheek right now. He told himself that he wasn't completely helpless, not yet. Dulcie looked over and mocked him, asking if he was really okay, then apologized with a smirk, claiming she must have let one slip by. Another student echoed the apology and promised to train harder. Chris shrugged it off, watching as the students regrouped and prepared to push forward with the mission. Their morale was battered, but their determination had hardened. Then, the atmosphere shifted. A mysterious figure appeared atop a dragon, observing them with an unsettling calm. He exclaimed that he had considered the possibility, but now that he'd seen it for himself, it really was Chris. Chris narrowed his eyes and muttered under his breath, confused. He didn't recognize the man, but everything about his entrance screamed, mastermind. Then a more alarming thought struck him. Was this the one who had teleported them to the plains? The figure, blindfolded and wrapped in bandages, stepped down and addressed Chris with a chilling familiarity. He said that he had waited a long time to see him. Chris, still silent, wondered why the man had removed his hood so casually if he was trying to hide his identity. He speculated on their connection and noted with unease that the man was staring at him with an intensity that felt emotional. Chris thought that his expression resembled the gaze of a love-struck maiden, and the realization made him cringe. Noticing the strange glances his students were casting him, Chris grimaced. He told them silently that they were completely wrong. He had no idea who this guy was. The man asked if Chris wasn't happy to see him. He then added, with a teasing smile, that if Chris was still upset about the past, he was sorry. Chris didn't respond, his expression unreadable, but inside he was spiraling. He had no memories of what the previous Chris had been through. Still, he told himself that he had to keep playing the role, no matter what. Michael called out, but when the students caught sight of Chris's eyes, they froze. The look in them was colder and more cautious than they had ever seen. One whispered that this man must be incredibly dangerous, for Professor Chris to appear that guarded. Chris observed the stranger more carefully. The man was controlling monsters like they were pets. That could only mean one thing. He was likely the one who had summoned the horned rabbit in the first place. The figure sighed dramatically, lamenting that he had thought someone had killed his precious darlings, only to find out it was Chris. Michael trembled as he admitted that without Chris's intervention, he wouldn't have survived. The man continued, explaining that his master had merely wanted to check on the young master's progress. He admitted he had planned to kill one of Michael's friends in front of him, just to test him, but hadn't anticipated Chris showing up. He then asked Chris to see it from his side too. The hooded figure stepped closer and placed his hands on Chris's shoulders. The students tensed, ready to strike, but Chris raised a hand to signal them to stand down. Still silent, Chris listened as the man asked why he hadn't said anything. He remarked that making excuses didn't suit Chris. Michael watched with growing dread. He could see Chris's killer expression, but noticed that he wasn't retaliating. Michael wondered if it was because of them, if Chris was holding back for their sake. The thought frustrated him. He hated being a burden. He admitted silently that at his current level, he could only fight monsters already on the brink of death. The man told Chris that since they were both just following orders, he wouldn't interfere further. Then, with a softened tone, he added that a simple, "good job," from Chris would lift his spirits. Michael observed him with narrowed eyes. He thought that the man seemed to care for Chris, but the tone of his affection was twisted. This wasn't friendship. It was selfish obsession dressed as devotion. The figure offered to help Chris if things were too difficult, reminding him that he had always said his face was beautiful. Then, with no warning, Chris struck. In a single flash, the hooded figure was caught off guard. Michael was tense. Chris had suddenly drawn a sword and placed it against the neck of the stranger, and Michael was still trying to process what just happened. His mind raced. Where had that sword even come from? Creation magic was rare, nearly impossible. Only a handful of people across the continent could wield it. But then again, if anyone could, it would be Professor Chris. Chris asked the stranger what kind of nonsense he had been spouting all this time. He told him to go talk in his sleep, calling him trash. The stranger tensed but responded that Chris was still holding a grudge over that, wasn't he? Chris smiled on the outside, but internally, he was shaken. He thought to himself that he had been saved thanks to the protagonist defeating the 50th monster. He had wished for it so badly, prayed in his heart that at least one of the fallen enemies would be taken out. A short while before, Michael had felt disheartened. He wasn't on the same level as Chris or that stranger. That fact stung. But despite that, he'd done what he could. He'd killed a monster. And that single act completed Chris's task from the system: defeat 50 monsters. As the task cleared, the system notified Chris of his reward. He had obtained the map of Vidal Academy, 3/4, and an ancient sword. The system instructed him to remove the monkey keyholder and equip the rusty sword instead. Chris, without hesitation, asked the system to do it immediately. The rusty, ancient sword materialized in his grip. That's why it was in his hand now, pressed against the stranger's throat. The system explained that the sword could cut through most materials and had 3/3 usable durability. Chris thanked Michael aloud and, silently, he thought that it was thanks to him that he managed to preserve both his life and his dignity. He acknowledged to himself, Michael had done well. The stranger commented that Chris didn't seem in the mood to talk today and said he'd come back another time. He added that if Chris ever needed help, he could be reached through the master. But Chris responded sharply. He told the stranger that if he didn't want his mouth torn open, he should vanish immediately. Internally, he was relieved that the stranger left without further drama. Once the stranger was gone, Chris and Michael turned their attention to the students. The fear was obvious on their faces. Dolce remarked that she had barely been able to breathe and had run out of mana. Michael asked if she was okay. Chris didn't reply. Instead, he instructed Angelina to send word to the academy. They needed a carriage to return. Angelina responded that she understood and added that it would have been better if they'd called for reinforcements earlier. Dolce commented that if their teacher had used spatial magic, everything could have been wrapped up in an instant. Chris didn't answer that either. Michael interjected, suggesting that Professor Chris was just tired and probably needed some time to think things through. Hearing that, tears welled up in Chris's eyes. He thought that he was truly glad Michael had been there today. Eventually, all members of Class 10 returned safely. The next day, Chris carried on with his usual routine, but his mind was still heavy. He thought that things were getting off to a rough start. He reflected on the life he had lived up to now and considered the man with bandages. That man was likely the character Maria. Not many had the ability to create chimeras or control monsters. And in the original story, Maria had never even been visually described. Being followed by someone so blatantly suspicious could only spell trouble. And Chris's instincts proved correct. A man stood in front of him now, causing a flicker of confusion in Chris. That man was Eugene. The homeroom teacher of Class Y. He greeted Chris and noted that he hadn't seen him in the cafeteria yet. He asked if Chris had eaten. Chris looked at Eugene and thought, of course, him too. The events of the field training had been so regular that the principal had summoned Class 10 immediately upon their return. But instead of disciplinary action or interrogation, the principal chose to reinforce the academy's defensive magic circle and imposed a gag order on the entire incident. On top of that, someone was assigned to monitor Chris. That someone was the narrow-eyed Eugene. Chris figured the principal had pieced it together, that the person who approached him had ties to the Demon Lord's army. Since there was a chance Chris might be colluding with them, the principal had appointed Eugene to keep an eye on him. Over 10 years ago, the Demon King had been defeated by the Holy Emperor and was believed to be long gone. But just like every fantasy cliché, he had only gone underground, working from the shadows to make a return. The story's protagonist was supposed to rise, hold himself back, and then take revenge. That was the premise of the strongest Demon King hero tale. And now Chris was caught in the middle, trapped between the Holy Emperor's faction and the Demon Lord's army. If Eugene caught on to anything, Chris knew he'd be in deep trouble. Eugene asked again if Chris wanted to have lunch together. Chris told him he was noisy and annoying, and that he should just disappear. Eugene replied with a calm tone, asking if his voice had been too loud. He then offered to lower it and added that many people told him he had a nice voice. Seeing Eugene act so bizarrely, Chris felt a surge of anger building inside. He clenched his fists but kept his cool. Inwardly, he questioned whether this guy was some kind of pervert too. He wondered bitterly if everyone around him had a screw loose. Then, keeping his tone sharp, he told Eugene to shut his mouth. Eugene only laughed in response. He said that shutting his mouth would be difficult, unless, of course, Chris wanted to cover it with his own hands. Chris shot back with a harsh reply, telling him to shove his own fist in his mouth. Just then, a new system quest popped up in Chris's mind. Wish of the Earth God 1-4. Building relationships with fellow teachers is also important. Try inviting a fellow teacher to hold a joint class. The rewards were listed. The map of Vidal Academy for the 4th S, and a rotten Mandragora route. But then came the kicker. Failure means death. The countdown started. 48 hours. Chris thought to himself that they weren't even pretending to hide the malice anymore. Do it or die had basically become the system's default setting. Left with no choice, he figured he'd have to use Eugene somehow. Eugene was, after all, the homeroom teacher of Class Y. The class that absorbed the most transfer students from Class 10. Still, he wondered how to propose something like a joint class without breaking character. He wasn't the friendly type. Certainly not a tsundere. Then it clicked. The quest only required the joint class. It didn't say they had to become friends. With that in mind, Chris addressed Eugene seriously. He said that because of him, he had wasted 5 minutes of his life. He added that while he would love to make him pay for that right now, he hoped his master would learn to love more things. And if that happened, that child would end up sad. Even as he said it, Chris cringed inside. He admitted to himself that even though he made this backstory, it was unbearably embarrassing. He pushed through and continued. He said that if Eugene was that desperate to get close to him, then they should have a match. His words were clear. The trash that Eugene was teaching versus the scum he had raised. They would see who was better. As he said it, Chris thought to himself that Eugene wouldn't refuse. He was under orders from the principal to get close and extract useful information. Eugene asked if Chris meant a match between their students. Chris confirmed, saying that if he won, Eugene should never show his face again. Eugene took a moment, then agreed. With a smile, he added that Chris had surprisingly fun ideas. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said that if he won, Chris would have to treat him to a meal. Chris, confused, wondered why Eugene was so obsessed with food. It didn't make sense. But out loud, he replied that there was no chance he would lose. Eugene agreed, saying it all sounded like fun. Then he asked when they should do it. Chris said the match would be held tomorrow afternoon. Eugene acknowledged the time and told him he'd see him then. As Chris turned away and walked off, he thought that the result didn't really matter. The only thing that counted was completing the quest by holding a joint class. But truthfully, with the kind of overachieving nerds in Class 10, he didn't think they would lose anyway. Unbeknownst to them, someone had been eavesdropping. That someone was Nika. Nika had heard the entire exchange and asked with excitement if Chris was having them compete against another class because he believed in them. The academy quickly caught fire with rumors. Whispers filled corridors, growing louder by the second. Students were buzzing. Had anyone heard? Class 10 and Class Y were going head to head. Curiosity spread like wildfire. People muttered in awe. Wasn't Class 10 the class where half the students tried to quit on day one? Where even making eye contact with the teacher was considered dangerous? Then came the real piece of gossip. The one that made jaws drop across campus. It wasn't just about student pride or class rankings. Professor Eugene's date was on the line. Meanwhile, Nika burst into his classroom like a whirlwind, slamming the door open with a dramatic crash. He asked loudly if everyone was already there. Inside, his 4 closest classmates looked up, startled. Dolce lounged at her desk, yawning. She said that she only came because he called it an emergency. She asked what was going on. Angelina, spinning a lock of her ice blue hair between her fingers, let out a sigh. She said she had dinner plans, so whatever it was had better be quick. Nika flashed a grin. He told them they were going up against Class Y. Angelina shrugged and said the teacher had already mentioned it but wondered aloud if there was more to it. Leaning in with exaggerated secrecy, Nika dropped the real bomb. He said that if they lost, Professor Chris would have to go on a date with Eugene. The room went completely still. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. Dolce nearly choked, asking if he was serious. Angelina laughed in disbelief, asking if he had misheard or was just imagining things. Nika crossed his arms and declared proudly that he was a tot, and tots don't lie. He said he overheard them himself. They were definitely talking about it. Even Michael, who rarely said anything, perked up at that. He asked if it was really a date with their teacher. Dolce chimed in with a teasing grin, suggesting that technically, eating out with someone of the opposite sex counted as a date. She added that it was the first time anyone had heard of Professor Eugene doing something like that. Angelina agreed, saying she always thought of him as more of a lone wolf. Nika then added with dramatic flair that Professor Chris had totally snapped. He recounted how Chris had declared that if Class 10 won, Eugene was never to show his face again. Nika's eyes lit up with fire as he declared that if Professor Eugene believed in them, then they had no choice but to give it everything they had. He emphasized that losing simply wasn't an option. They had to win and make their professor proud. Despite the seriousness of his tone, he admitted he was also just a little curious about the whole date situation. Still, he insisted, there was no way they could allow themselves to lose to Class Y. They couldn't let their professor down. Angelina panicked at the sight of Michael's fists, which had started to spark with magical energy. She pointed it out with alarm and told him to calm down before he accidentally set something on fire. Meanwhile, Professor Chris stood silently at the edge of the training ground, watching as students from both classes gathered. He sighed heavily, his thoughts trailing toward the absurdity of the situation. This whole date rumor had gotten way too far out of control. Across from him, Professor Eugene approached with his ever-neutral expression. Chris observed the disparity in their class sizes with visible irritation. He mentally noted how uneven it all looked. There was no way this setup was balanced. Eugene broke the silence by explaining the match format. He said it would be one-on-one duels, and the first team to achieve 3 wins would be declared the victor. Chris scoffed at the structure, remarking that it all seemed like such a hassle. He sarcastically suggested it might be quicker to just throw everyone in and let them brawl it out. Eugene calmly countered that it was too early in their training to be teaching team battles. Chris raised a brow at that, thinking about how his students had already performed combo attacks like it was second nature. That main character buff really was something else. Without hesitation, he was told to pick his first fighter. Chris didn't overthink it. His strategy was simple, level up and smash through everything. Nika was his first choice. Nika stood at attention, offering a proud salute. He said he would return victorious. Chris, deadpan, reminded him that it wasn't a battle to the death, but he appreciated the enthusiasm. The arena buzzed with anticipation. The referee raised a hand and announced the first match, Nika Todd versus Serena Gale. The rules were simple. Whoever hit 0 health first would lose, and the match would end instantly. He ordered the fighters to take their positions and began the countdown. 3, 2, 1. Begin. Serena lunged in aggressively, her blade cutting through the air, but Nika met her with perfect timing. He inhaled, then countered with a clean, powerful arc of his sword. There was a loud clang, and Serena went flying. She dropped to the ground, stunned. The crowd gasped. The referee declared Class 10's Nika Todd the winner of the first round. Nika jogged over to his opponent and offered a hand. He asked if she was all right and offered to help her up. Serena gritted her teeth but managed a faint smile, promising to win next time. Chris blinked in disbelief. He looked around, expecting shock, but no one else seemed fazed. He overheard murmurs from other teachers. They said it wasn't surprising. It was the Tots, after all. High expectations came with the name. Chris nearly choked. That kind of power from a support class? He couldn't believe it. Off to the side, Michael beamed with pride and commented on how strong Nika had become. Chris exhaled, feeling a strange mix of relief and awe. At least he wasn't the only one blown away. Eugene, calm as ever, asked who was next. Chris smirked and pretended to ponder it, but he already knew. His next pick was Angelina. Angelina straightened immediately and said with confidence that she would bring home another win. Chris had already calculated the rest. With Angelina in play, this could be wrapped up quickly. There was no need to risk the healers or the rookies. Michael looked up at Chris, his eyes hopeful. He silently begged for a chance. Dolce giggled and teased him, wondering why he was giving her such a look. The referee's voice cut in. The second match was about to begin. Angelina summoned her ice spear, shimmering with raw magic, and charge. Her opponent parried, but her rapid and unrelenting strikes forced them backward. Teachers on the sidelines whispered in recognition. They acknowledged her as the heir of the Sheriff family, her ice magic textbook perfect. Chris's jaw slackened slightly as he watched the battle. The sound effects alone, those sparkles and crashes, made it feel cinematic. It was seriously cool. With a final, blinding thrust, Angelina knocked her opponent off their feet. The referee raised a hand and called it. Class 10's Angelina Sheriff had taken the second win. Angelina gave a satisfied grin and looked over at Chris with a proud glint in her eyes. Chris thought she looked like a smug family pet waiting for praise. He wanted to acknowledge her, but had to stay in character. He barked at her to get back in line. Angelina flinched and replied that she was already on her way. Eugene, meanwhile, crossed his arms and noted aloud that just one more win would end it for them. Chris cracked his knuckles and declared it was time to finish things. He called out his next fighter, Dolce. But then, suddenly and loudly, she raised her hand and announced her forfeit. Gasps echoed around her. Nika's eyes widened in confusion. He asked if she was sick or maybe if she was giving up to let the professor go on a date. Chris turned his head sharply. He thought to himself, what's a date? But he pushed that aside and asked Dolce for her reason directly. Had she gotten cold feet? Dolce shook her head with her usual easygoing smile and said it wasn't that. She explained that it just didn't feel fair. Technically, she said, she shouldn't be allowed to compete in a one-on-one match. Chris frowned slightly. Deep inside, he knew she had a point. Dolce had an invisible sixth member of the protagonist party. Her twin sister. But that fact was supposed to remain a tightly guarded secret. No one else was supposed to know about the existence of her twin due to complicated circumstances. He watched her closely, trying to figure out what she was plotting. Dolce turned toward Michael with a teasing gleam in her eye and declared that he would take her place. Chris sighed inwardly. Of course. She was trying to hand the spotlight to the protagonist. She likely thought it was time to let him shine. Chris didn't really mind. Losing once wouldn't be the end of the world. He called out to Michael, asking if he was ready. Michael stepped forward, fists clenched, eyes blazing with determination. He said he would give it his all and make sure to win. Chris nodded mentally. It was just a match between students. It should be fine. The match officially began. Michael stepped into the arena with tense shoulders and a burning resolve. Across from him stood a student with a twisted grin and eyes full of malice, the academy's most notorious bully. The bully sneered as he locked eyes with Michael. He said that Michael, a filthy, cursed commoner, should feel honored just to face him in combat. From the sidelines, Chris's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened, and cold sweat trickled down his back. He realized, too late, that this was one of those mob characters. Those generic bullies written into the world specifically to torment the protagonist. The bully stepped closer, mockery thick in his voice. He called out to Michael, goading him to say something, anything. But Michael stood motionless. His face was pale, locked in place, his jaw clenched. He couldn't respond. Chris tensed. He knew characters like this existed in the scenario, but the timing couldn't be worse. The bully, sensing weakness, doubled down. Then came the unforgivable line. He asked Michael how it felt to enroll at the academy after killing his own mother, calling him trash. Michael's entire body reacted violently. His posture stiffened, his features twisted with pain, and rage pulsed behind his eyes. A sharp, splitting headache struck him, and through gritted teeth, he managed only a broken warning. He told the bully not to say that. Chris's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized the signs instantly. This wasn't just a spike in magic power. This was something else entirely. This was the aftermath of the incomplete awakening from before. Whatever it was, it had left Michael dangerously unstable. Chris's gut twisted. He thought frantically, this was bad. This was a berserk transformation. The bully, clueless and arrogant, just laughed. He told Michael to stay still and boasted that he'd finish the match in a single blow. Chris couldn't take any more. The time for playing roles was over. Without hesitation, he shouted across the arena, "The match is cancelled." But he was too late. An overwhelming, pitch-black aura erupted from Michael's body. It poured out like ink from a shattered bottle, forming a storm of malevolence around him. The air turned heavy, crackling with unstable energy. Students and teachers alike froze in place, horror painted across their faces. Chris stood frozen for a moment. It was already too far gone. Michael had fully transformed into a monster. His face contorted, no longer human. His true self had been completely submerged under a tidal wave of demonic energy. Panic swept through the crowd. Screams erupted from the bleachers. "Monster! Monster!" Students shrieked and scrambled for the exits. The bully who had just moments earlier taunted him now trembled, eyes wide with terror. He begged for someone, anyone, to help him, his voice cracking in desperation. At that moment, a familiar ding echoed in Chris's mind. A system window popped up in front of him. Quest difficulty may change depending on the situation. Please successfully complete the class as a teacher. Chris's jaw locked tight. He cursed under his breath. They were doing it again. The system was throwing impossible demands at him. They wanted him to stop the protagonist's rampage, physically. He had no other choice. With no time to spare, Chris sprang into action. The students gasped as he marched toward the chaos without hesitation. Someone shouted his name in alarm. "Teacher Chris." Chris clenched his fists. He reminded himself that, at the very least, this environment was designed so no one could die. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a sliver of Michael left inside. But just before he could reach the boy, Eugene stepped in. The other teacher appeared beside him, chanting quickly and conjuring glowing magical chains. He launched the bindings toward Michael, wrapping them around his body. The hope lasted only seconds. With a guttural roar, Michael snapped the chains like thread. A pulse of corrupted magic exploded outward, sending Eugene flying across the arena. He crashed hard, unconscious. The crowd erupted in screams. Another teacher cried out, ordering everyone to fall back and for faculty to prepare restraining spells. But panic spread just as quickly as the aura. One teacher screamed that it was no use. The magic wasn't working. The corrupted energy was disrupting everything. Voices echoed, "It's impossible, we can't stop him. Teacher Chris. Run." But Chris stood firm. He stepped into the dense, suffocating fog of energy, completely unflinching. Michael's monstrous figure twitched and froze. His glowing eyes locked onto Chris. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered inside them. One student whispered aloud that Chris wouldn't run. If it was him, he'd never abandon them. Michael, through the storm of darkness, trembled. His voice, weak and cracked, managed to form a plea. He begged Chris to run. He told him to get away, to save himself. Chris took a slow breath. His hands were shaking, but he buried the fear. He couldn't afford to break character now. Not when Michael was still reachable. He stepped forward and stared directly into his monstrous gaze. Michael stiffened, his body trembling again, but this time with hesitation. In a blink, Chris launched a kick into Michael's knee, knocking him off balance. As he fell forward, Chris caught him by the collar and yanked him close, his eyes burning with intensity. His voice cut through the fog, cold and absolute. "Is this the strength you wanted?" He told him that no matter what kind of fate he carried, if he truly resolved himself, he could become strong. That was why he had said it, because Michael had the power to change. But if he chose this path, there wouldn't be another chance. He stared into him. "Come back." The words struck like a bell in Michael's soul. The demonic fog faltered. His monstrous aura flickered, then dimmed. The pressure in the air began to lessen. "Come back, Michael." His eyes quivered. Slowly, painfully, his body began to settle. The real Michael reemerged, tired, broken, but still there. Chris walked away from Michael, keeping a steady pace until the crowd was far behind him. Once he reached a quiet spot, safely out of sight, he clenched his teeth and screamed inwardly in pain. His hands were scorched. The contact with Michael's demonic energy had seared through him. As he bit back the agony, a familiar system notification flashed before his eyes, alerting him that the quest was now complete. The reward list appeared. A Vidal Academy map and a Rotten Mandragora route. His map updated in real time. A new feature unlocked, location detection. As for the route, it was marked as a consumable item. It increased recovery speed by 200%, but with an unknown side effect. The system stated plainly that all Chapter 1 quests were now officially complete. Opening the map function, Chris checked his surroundings, even though his mind lingered on Michael. Concern tugged at him, but instead of heading toward the protagonist, he turned down another path and entered a building. Inside, he moved quietly, sneaking past the corridors. He told himself that hiding like this didn't match his character setting at all, but it was as if some trauma had triggered this habit. Perhaps the lingering fear of losing another disciple was to blame. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. The voice said that they knew Chris would come. It was Eugene. As Chris looked up, he saw Eugene sitting up on a bed, his chest heavily bandaged. Eugene remarked that Chris was truly a good person and invited him in. Chris thought immediately that Eugene had sharp instincts. Chris admitted aloud that what he had done earlier was foolish. Eugene responded with a laugh and said that he had figured that much out. Chris thought back to that moment. Eugene had jumped in without using any protective magic. He wondered if it was raw courage, or just plain stupidity. Eugene, still smiling brightly, explained that he had been confident he wouldn't die. If it meant owing a favor to the master, then it was a cheap price to pay in his view. Chris, gritting his teeth, cursed him inwardly. Eugene then asked about the bet. He wanted to know the outcome. If it came down to match wins, then Class 10 had clearly triumphed. Chris confirmed with cool indifference that Eugene had lost. Eugene grinned and declared that to celebrate Chris's win, he would treat him. Chris made a face of pure disgust and pointed out that Eugene was skipping the premise. Eugene laughed and claimed that he must have hit his head because he didn't remember things clearly. Chris turned his back and began to leave, saying that this was strictly a personal invitation. If Eugene really wanted to contact him, he was free to do so anytime. Behind him, Eugene squealed dramatically that he couldn't handle this kind of tsundere behavior. Once outside the room, Chris's cool facade collapsed. Panic hit him like a wave. He began questioning what had just happened. What was going on? Since when did this game have a dating element? He barely had time to think when a new system notification appeared, announcing that starting from Chapter 2, the story would branch depending on player choices. A new tab had unlocked. The route selection screen. 3 options blinked before him: Demon Lord route, Holy Emperor route, and the ominously titled Do Not Choose route. He raised an eyebrow and wondered what kind of twisted logic lay behind that last one. Also, why were there heart icons next to each choice? For now, he tapped to view the explanation behind each route. First, he selected the Demon Lord route. The system informed him that in this route, he had infiltrated Vidal Academy as a spy for the Demon Lord. His objective was to lure Michael Foxon to the demon's side and conquer the world. Individuals aligned with the demon side would become friendly, while those allied with the Holy Emperor would turn hostile. Next, he clicked on the Holy Emperor route. This one stated that Chris had betrayed the Demon Lord and decided to cultivate heroes within the Academy. His goal was to secure Michael's loyalty to the Holy Emperor and prevent the demon's resurrection. Demon-affiliated characters would become hostile, while the Holy Emperor's allies would treat him more favorably. Chris thought to himself that if he followed this path, he'd have to train Michael as a holy knight. Then he selected the do not choose route. The system asked in disbelief. Not choosing? Really? It labeled the route as a terrible option for indecisive, incompetent players. Characters on both sides would become suspicious of him. Chris considered the warning. He acknowledged internally that being part of a faction offered more security, but each path had a major drawback. Choosing the Holy Emperor route meant dealing with someone like Maria. But if he aligned with the Demon Lord, Eugene would become his enemy, a fate he absolutely didn't want. That left only one path. He tapped the screen, accepting the do not choose route, and muttered that there was no turning back now. At first, he didn't regret it. But that didn't last. The flutter of a butterfly's wings, he thought, could stir up a storm. Any consequence was fair game now. He found himself shouting aloud in his room, questioning why he, a supposed main character, was suddenly being thrown out of his job the very next day. He remembered the look on his colleague's face when she told him that he was now on leave, per the principal's orders. She would be taking over Class 10 starting tomorrow. The reason? The principal claimed Chris had been acting too independently, so he was being put on temporary leave. Chris suddenly remembered the system warning. Individuals on both sides would become wary. He connected the dots. His choice of the do not choose route had officially branded him as suspicious. Rumors began circulating throughout the school. He collapsed on his bed with a groan, admitting that the other routes were still too dangerous. Besides, his character was supposed to be unreadable. He never expected to be kicked out for it, though. The Demon Lord route was too dangerous to even consider, and the phrasing in the Holy Emperor route, pledge loyalty, bothered him. Fanatics never used that kind of language without reason. Because of his character setting, he couldn't even grovel and beg them to reconsider. Just as he began to convince himself to enjoy this rare vacation, another system notification hit him. Parent Master Day was approaching. He froze. This was the first time he had even heard of it. The system explained that the students' parents were naturally curious about how their tuition fees were being used. As a master living off their money, Chris was required to make the event a success for Class 10. A reward box would be given upon success. Failure, naturally, would result in death. He had 72 hours. Chris exploded in frustration, yelling at the absurdity of holding a Parent Master Day for students who weren't even in elementary school. He questioned whether he could even prepare a class worth showing. But more urgently, he was currently unemployed. Determined, he clenched his fists. Vacation was over before it began. He had 72 hours to return to work and survive.